Here we will take a closer look at the Wisconsin UPC, focusing on how to use the UPC for the inpatient to outpatient levels of care. This is because the recommendations for withdrawal management services and screening in this area generally requires additional training, usually provided by an agency. The general instructions for completing the Wisconsin UPC Adult Placement Scoring Instrument include 8 steps and are as follows. First, identify or rule out intoxication and/or incapacitation. Also, evaluate withdrawal potential if present. Second, complete the substance use disorder screening. Third, evaluate the individual for treatment service qualifying criteria based on information acquired from the screening. Fourth, evaluate the individual within treatment dimensions and severity indicators. Fifth, transfer treatment indicator scores to the scoring grid and identify recommended level of care. 6. Complete interviewers' comments and record any need for an alternative level of care. 7. Record the individual's willingness acceptance statement. And 8. Complete referral information and signature section. You can use the UPC form I provided as we now continue through each section. With that general overview, now let's take a closer look at each part of the UPC. The front page requires the provider to fill in the client's name, some basic demographic information, as well as the interviewer's name and the agency where the screening is taking place. The next page is used to mark the presence or absence of intoxication, incapacitation, and withdrawal symptoms. This is referred to as Dimension Area 1 of the UPC. Marking the presence of any of these areas will require identifying the severity indicator, labeled with letters A through E, associated with the type of substance used and that the client received the appropriate services to address this substance withdrawal. Depending on the level of care offered by an agency, this may require medical attention and/or a referral for specialized care for these areas. If the client does not show any intoxication, incapacitation, or withdrawal, the provider will move on to completing the substance use disorder screening. This begins on the next page, which covers treatment service qualifying criteria. With information obtained from the client, you will identify which qualifying criteria are currently present. This is a general snapshot of any negative consequences the client has experienced due to substance use. Negative consequences are looked at in the 7 areas found on this page. In this section, the provider can check as many of the boxes that are present. You are not limited to just checking one box. The benefit of this section is, even if the client has only one qualifying criteria present, there is a guarantee that they will qualify for some level of care, usually outpatient services. Moving to the next page, this starts the 4th step of the UPC, evaluating the client with treatment dimensions 2 through 5, along with severity indicators. This is used to determine what level of care best matches the client needs based on current use levels. While the treatment service qualifying criteria identifies only the general presence of consequences related to substance use, the treatment dimensions go into much more detail related to the specific consequences and level of severity the client is experiencing. This added detail will help the provider to pinpoint the level of care that best matches the client's treatment needs. In dimensions 2 through 5, you will determine yes or no for each area. If the yes box is marked, then the provider will need to determine the severity indicator that best matches the client's situation. The severity indicator boxes are associated with levels of care. The highest level of care is rated as a 4 and is attached to medically managed inpatient care. 3 is attached to medically monitored, usually the residential level of care. 2 is intensive outpatient or day treatment level of care, and 1 is attached to the outpatient level of care. In dimensions 2 through 5, if the yes box is marked, the provider can then choose only one severity indicator box. You will need to choose the one box that best matches the client. By doing this, you will be able to identify which level of care from 4 to 1 is needed. So, starting with Dimension Area 2, this identifies the severity of consequences associated with physical and mental health conditions. This area generally targets how severe the substance use is impacting medical and mental health conditions and diagnoses. If the yes box is checked in Dimension 2, based on the client's information, the provider will determine the severity indicator based on the length of stability that the client has been able to maintain and what type of monitoring is needed. The severity indicator boxes for this area are labeled with letters A through G. Moving to Dimension 3, this looks at any negative emotional and behavioral consequences associated with the client's substance use. What differentiates Dimension Area 2 from 3 is that in 2, we are usually targeting diagnosed conditions, and in 3, we are identifying how substance use seems to be impacting the client's day-to-day impact on their feelings, emotions, and behaviors. Checking yes in this box will again require the provider to determine the severity indicator based on the length of stability the client has been able to maintain and what type of monitoring is needed. The severity indicator boxes for this area are labeled with letters A through D. Next is Dimension 4, which addresses relapse potential. If a yes box is checked, the provider again determines the severity indicator that best matches the client's situation. For this dimension is based on how much time the client is able to remain substance-free and, if enrolled in any recovery services, able to be engaged and progress with their treatment goals. The severity indicator boxes for this area are labeled with the letters A through I. Lastly is Dimension 5, which looks at the client's environment. Here we are looking to see if the environment encourages continued substance use or helps to foster recovery. If the yes box is checked, the provider will identify the severity indicator based on factors such as if the client's environment might be purposefully or unintentionally encouraging use and or sabotaging any recovery efforts, or if the client's environment contains some recovery support. The severity indicator boxes for this area are labeled with the letters A through D. Once the dimension areas are completed, you will proceed to the fifth step, which is to transfer what was marked in each dimension area to the scoring grid. By transferring all the scores to the scoring grid, it is easier to see each area next to each other and determine the client's overall score. This overall score will then give the provider the recommended level of care associated with that score. With this score, the provider will then complete the final steps of the UPC. The scoring grid is broken down into 3 areas: the treatment service qualifying criteria, score 1 and 2. The treatment service qualifying criteria refers to boxes 1 through 7 at the top of the grid. Here you would just transfer which boxes you marked. For example, if you checked 1, 2, and 5 from the list of treatment service qualifying criteria near the beginning of the UPC, you would make sure to check the 1, 2, and 5 boxes at the top of this page. For scores 1 and 2, these relate to the dimensions 1 through 5. Score 1 is connected to dimension 1, which relates to intoxication, incapacitation, and withdrawal symptoms. Score 2 is connected to dimensions 2 through 5. Starting first with score 1, the provider would go back to dimension 1 to see if the yes box was checked, and if yes, which severity indicator from A through E was marked. You would then transfer the letter-number combination associated with which box was checked. For example, if D was checked, you would go to dimension number 1D and write in D1. As stated before, marking the presence of dimension 1 will require that the client receive the appropriate services to first address issues in these areas. Depending on the level of care offered by an agency, this may require medical attention or a referral for specialized care for these areas. If the no boxes were checked in dimension 1, then you would simply make an X through this area or a 0 with a line through it. Moving to score 2, here you will be going back to any of the dimensions 2 through 5 that you marked the yes box. From there you would transfer the number corresponding to which severity indicator letter box was checked. For example, if dimension 2 was marked yes and the severity indicator D was checked, the provider would transfer the number 3 to the D box under dimension 2 on the scoring grid. If dimension 4 was marked yes and the severity indicator F was selected, the provider would transfer the number 1 to the F box under dimension 4 on the scoring grid. With score 2, after transferring the severity indicator scores for each of the dimensions checked, you will look at the highest single score there, meaning you do not add the numbers or look for the number that was checked the most. you look for the single highest score throughout dimensions 2 through 5. So, let's say that the provider marked yes to dimensions 2, 3, 4, and 5. From there, the severity indicator in area 2 resulted in a 2 score, and the severity indicators 3 to 5 resulted in 1 scores in each area. You would still need to put a 2 in the score 2 area. With that 2 score, you can move to the next page and circle the UPC's recommended level of care, 1A through 4, for treatment services, which in this case would be a 2 and would match with day treatment or intensive outpatient services. While this score translates to the UPC's recommended level of care, one of the benefits of the UPC is that it does leave room for the provider to determine if that is indeed the best overall treatment services when completing the final steps in the process. This can be done because the UPC allows for the provider to consider what levels of care are accessible to the client without hardship, as well as the client's overall motivation for that level of care. I will go into the most common scenarios that usually occur. For the purposes of this class, we'll be focusing on scenarios which pertain to how to use the UPC for inpatient to outpatient levels of care. Let's take the 2 score that I just used, which would recommend day treatment services. One scenario would be that the client also agrees that this is the best fit, has access to this level of care, and can be admitted into a day treatment program. In this scenario, I would include under the interviewer's comments that the client best matches with day treatment services. Under individual statement, I would include their comments about wanting and accepting this level of care. From there, I would reaffirm day treatment by filling it in under recommended level of service, complete the agency the client will receive services, and both the client and I would sign at the bottom of the form. A different scenario with the 2 score that might occur would be that I agree that day treatment is the best option and the client also agrees. However, there are no day treatment services available in that area, only outpatient services. More so, traveling to another county would not be possible due to transportation barriers. In this scenario, I would indicate this under interviewer's comments. I would document that day treatment services are not accessible for this client and would indicate that the next best match based on client needs would be outpatient. I would also indicate the client's willingness to accept this plan under the individual statement. I would then fill in the area titled Alternative Levels of Service identified with outpatient services and complete the remaining forms of the area. A final scenario that can occur is where the provider agrees that day treatment service is the best match. This level of care is available and accessible, but the client does not want to engage in that level of care. There could be many reasons for this, but the most common are that the client's work schedule, childcare needs, or other life priorities would make it a hardship to participate in this level of care. More so, when discussing this level of care with the client notes being very motivated for outpatient services, but is honest that they would not follow through with attending day treatment due to what was just described. In these situations, a provider needs to make the best clinical decision on what would foster a positive recovery outcome for the client. Here, the provider would take into account the level of care recommended, the client's motivation, and what might generate the best recovery outcome. Often in these scenarios, it is helpful to collaborate with a colleague or supervisor to agree on the best plan. If it is determined that provider believes that recommending outpatient services as an alternative service plan is in the best interest of the client, this would then be indicated in both the interviewer and individual statement. However, in this type of scenario, it is only recommended to do an alternative service plan for a limited period of time and then reassess if recovery progress is being made. For example, in this scenario, I would write that outpatient services would be recommended for 30 days. At 30 days, another screening would be done to identify if progress in treatment was being made. If yes, at that time, continuation of outpatient services would continue to be recommended. If no, then the original recommendation for day treatment services would be pursued. This type of alternative plan allows for 1. The client to have a chance at the level of care that might lead to recovery success versus not engaging in any treatment service at all, and 2, also creating a second check period to ensure that progress is being made. If the alternative service plan is not leading to progress in treatment services, then the higher level of care will be reinforced. This is needed to make sure the client is actually receiving effective treatment services. During class, we will take more time to discuss these different scenarios in more detail.